Okay, I am apologizing in advance because the rest of the video is blurry. I am still getting used to filming my YouTube videos using my mirrorless camera, and sometimes that means that I don't do it perfectly, but I think the content is so worth it, so I'm gonna just go ahead. Here's the video. All right, guys, so I know that it is January, but if you are hot off of editing a ton over the fall season, this video is for you. I'm gonna be sharing 3 tips with you to increase and improve your editing time. I wanna tell you guys a secret that I feel like doesn't get talked about enough, but the way that you photograph actually has a really direct impact on how easy or how difficult it's going to be editing your photos at the end. But before we dive in, if you haven't gotten to know me before, I am Manali of Manali Photography. I started out as a wedding photographer about 10 years ago, and I have recently pivoted into editing for wedding photographers and becoming a business coach for photographers who are ambitious and looking to grow and scale their impact and their income. So last thing before we dive in, I do actually have a free guide that includes more than just these 3 tips on how to speed up your editing workflow and your editing efficiency. So if you haven't already snagged up before, be sure to grab it down below. It's in the description. There's a link to it. I'll make sure that it's super easy for you guys to access. And that has even more tips that are just like this. So if you watch everything, you're like, oh, knew these 3 things, check out that guide because I'm sure that there's something in there that even the most seasoned photographers, and if you have one of your own editing hacks, be sure to leave that down in the comments below so that everybody who sees those can benefit from that as well. I'm going to go through 3 hacks that I have for you guys. The very first hack is actually to shoot in Kelvin. So if you've been a photographer for a while, you've probably heard about the benefits of shooting in manual, but something that sometimes people don't start doing until a little bit later is actually shooting in manual Kelvin. So really manually manipulating your white balance. My preferable white balance setting to use is actually Kelvin because I can dial it to be exactly what looks right and as close to perfect in camera as possible. And so the biggest thing with shooting in manual Kelvin mode is to make sure that if you're changing locations, especially on a wedding day, or if it goes from really sunny and bright to maybe really overcast, you want to make sure that you adjust for that. But the very thing that I love about Kelvin is that even if you guess the Kelvin number wrong by a little or a lot, I've actually done this before, it is actually so easy to edit that in Lightroom later because you can just change the Kelvin on one image in a giant batch of photos and then sync that Kelvin across all of the photos so that it's perfect looking in Lightroom. So for example, I have actually accidentally left my Kelvin on the indoor setting when I went outdoors to take family portraits during a wedding a couple of years ago. And so when I was looking at my camera photos after the fact, I realized that all of the family photos were super, super blue. And at first I was like, oh dang, I forgot to change my Kelvin. But it was a really easy fix in Lightroom because I just changed the Kelvin on that very first family photo in Lightroom. And then I just synced the Kelvin white balance across all of those photos. And it was a 2 or 3 second fix. So that's one of the benefits of shooting in Kelvin. It just makes it really easy to adjust for it in Lightroom versus if you're on auto white balance, your camera is a little bit warmer, a little bit colder for every single photo. And that's a lot to have to manually tweak after the fact to get it looking really consistent in Lightroom afterwards. So that's my number 1 tip is shoot in Kelvin, do it manually so that you can batch adjust the white balance really easily in post-processing. It saves you so much editing time. It was a tip that I wish I had learned way earlier in the game when I was photographing weddings. And this goes for portraits as well. Okay, now on to editing hack number 2. This is something that you might know, but there are going to be other photographers that don't know this out there. So this hack is actually twofold. So number 1, if you are a wedding photographer, I always recommend that you start editing your weddings backwards. So what this is gonna do is you're gonna be starting with the reception images, which tend to be a little bit more repetitive, not as super aesthetic and pretty, and not like the highlights of the wedding day that you absolutely love. You wanna start editing backwards because you'll get the hardest done first, get your momentum rolling. So that's part 1 of this hack. Part 2 is that you should always edit what we call your anchor photos first. So anchor photos are just going to be one photo from each lighting scenario basically, or each part of the day, and one from each camera body. So one for your camera during portrait times and one for your second shooter's camera during portrait times. If you want to go a step further, you can even do this by different lenses and editor always asks my photographers to just send me like a couple within each part of the day that are edited, and then make sure that they have one or two of their second photographer's images edited so that they can tell me how they want to best match those two together, especially if you're on a Nikon and a Canon camera, or a Nikon and a Sony camera or something like that. The way that I do this within my own editing workflow is to actually go through and edit the highlights of a wedding day or a portrait session first, and I'll be really specific, picking out those certain types of photos during certain parts of the day, edit those first 100 to 150 first, get all of the edits on that done really perfectly, and then that's actually the bulk of my time, because then from there I can take those anchor photos and sync those settings across the rest of the images, and then go back one by one to make sure that everything looks really perfect. But as I'm going through each of the individual photos, instead of having to figure out the white balance and the contrast and the highlights and shadows and all of the color settings, I'm primarily just cropping and straightening from there, because the color settings are pretty close and accurate to those anchor settings. Editing hack number 3 is to use reference mode if you're really trying to get your edits to look really consistent across the board. So what you're going to do is you're going to go to the library grid mode. You're going to right click on your anchor image. I always recommend having your anchor images tagged by something specific. So if you want to make them all the color green, I think that's if you click 6 on the keyboard, that might be green and might be red. You tell me after you try this tip. Have a specific way of tagging your anchor images so that when you're going through the full library, it's very easy to tell which ones are your anchor images. And then with an anchor image, what you're going to do for each section is you're going to double click on that anchor photo, or right click. You're going to hit set as reference photo. And then when you're in the develop mode, you're going to hit Shift R or Command Shift R to pull open reference mode. And that way you can see your reference photo and the photo that you're currently editing side by side. So it's really easy to match your edits as close as possible. So that wasn't something that I had ever heard of as just a photographer editing photos before. So I hope that tip's helpful. And if it's new and you try it out and you love it, let me know. All right, so those are some of my 3 best tips for increasing your editing efficiency. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I also have a free guide that includes a couple more tips for you guys to use to really speed up your editing workflow this year. So if you haven't already, be sure to grab it down in the description below. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you have any other videos that you want me to record on, whether that's about wedding, editing, about weddings themselves, about photography or photography business, please be sure to leave it down in a comment below, and I will catch you guys in the next YouTube video.